What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Wednesday, August 28th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. We have a nice 8-game MLB slate tonight. Weather looks okay right now. I know I've said that each of the last 2 days, and it ended up not being okay. But right now it looks okay. Hopefully that holds. As always, do pay attention to that throughout the day. But looks like a pretty nice 8-gamer. We do have a game in Coors Field that obviously is going to draw a lot of attention and kind of shape how you play the slate. We also have a couple of clear top options at pitcher in Chris Sale and Freddie Peralta, and then a pretty big drop-off where no other pitcher has a combination of like a great matchup and great stuff and a good park or all of that. So pretty wide open slate when it comes to pitching, with the exception of those two guys at the top. So it should be pretty fun to look at from a tournament standpoint. As usual, going to walk through position by position, stack by stack, looking at what I'd be getting to if the slate started right now. My apologies if I get caught up trying to find something. SaberSim did completely overhaul the way that their site looks, and I found out like 30 minutes ago. So I think I'm caught up, but there is a chance that I get hung up at some point and can't find something. Also, I think my player exposures look pretty good, but there is some chance too that like something weird happened, because this is the first time that I've run anything with their new updates, but everything I think looks pretty good. So starting with pitching here, you can see it on the screen already. Freddie Peralta showing up a ton for me. He's projected for about 45% ownership, likely to be the most popular pitcher on the slate. It's definitely going to be one of him or Chris Sale. I have him projected a little bit higher, but he is $1,200 less expensive than Sale. He's obviously not as good a pitcher, but he does have the second highest strikeout percentage on the slate at 27.5%, 3.92 xFIP. Pretty solid strikeout matchup going up against the Giants as well. Their active roster ranks 9th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. 100 WRC plus ranks about 19th. So just looks like a pretty good spot for Peralta, all things considered. If this were a slate where you had a really strong mid-range of pitchers in that like 8 to 9K range, then I wouldn't really love Peralta at 9,800, but it's not. It's a slate where you have Sale for 1,200 more, you have Peralta, and then you just have a bunch of kind of questionable options, like I mentioned before. So it really makes Peralta stand out, kind of in the same way that Logan Gilbert did last night. I'm not saying that you should expect anything close to what Gilbert got you. Obviously, that was unexpected even for him, and you're not expecting that from Peralta either. But what I mean is just that the reason I was getting 95% Gilbert on the show yesterday, and I ended up playing 100%, is because there just wasn't really anything in his price range that compared when you consider talent level and matchup and park. And for Peralta here, the park in Milwaukee, not as good as T-Mobile is for Logan Gilbert. The matchup against the Giants isn't as good as Gilbert's matchup was against Tampa Bay. So again, I'm not saying he is the same as Logan Gilbert last night, but you just don't have any pitchers in his price range that look, really, you don't have any pitchers in his price range, but you also don't have any pitchers in his price range that look nearly as good. You have to pay more for Chris Sale. And then, like, yeah, you can go down to Corbin Burns. He's facing the Dodgers. Eduardo Rodriguez has been awful. He's making his fourth or fifth start of the season. But it's not like you can have any amount of real confidence in him. There's just such a big drop off at pitcher after Peralta that it really just forces a lot of exposure to the combination of Peralta and Sale. And then you consider that Peralta is less expensive than Sale. A lot there is going to depend on what offenses you want to go to as far as what you can afford. But that's why Peralta is showing up so much for me. He'd be in 87% of my lineups if the slate started right now. Sale would be in 38%, which is more or less in line with the field. It's a pretty middle of the road matchup for Sale. Minnesota's active roster doesn't strike out a ton against left-handed pitching. They rank 21st. In WRC plus, they rank, I believe it was 19th. So it's not a great matchup. It's not a terrible matchup. Chris Sale is hands down the best pitcher on the slate when it comes to talent. 32.7% K percentage is the highest mark by about 5 points. 2.52 xFIP is like a full run better than anybody else pitching today. So hands down the number one pitcher as far as talent goes. It's just a matter of finding the salary for him, and then also factoring in, not only are you paying 11K, but you're getting a pitcher that's 40+% owned in a average matchup. So it's one, what score do you need from him to justify 11K? I think that, it's obviously a mistake to assume that you need 30 plus because he's 11K or anything like that. If he goes and gets 20 plus points, he's pretty likely to just be a very useful play, even though he's more expensive. But the other issue is if you're paying 11K for Sale, how much are you pigeonholing yourself into lineups that are very, very similar to the lineups that the rest of the field is playing? Because once you pay 11K for Sale, you either are then also paying 9,800 for Peralta, and one, you have two very popular pitchers, and then two, you have a very limited amount of salary left, and so you only have so many teams you can choose from the stack at that point. So your lineups are probably going to overlap pretty drastically with the other Peralta plus Sale teams. Or if you don't go Peralta as your SP2, you have a limited number of SP2 options, whether it's Bassett, Festa, Rodriguez, Burns, Leiter, Severino, Bayo, like any of these guys are okay. There are not really many bad pitchers on this slate, but you're just kind of pushing yourself into a lineup construction that's going to be used very, very heavily. So that is one concern to pay attention to, or one thing to pay attention to. Obviously, you want to pay attention to the ownership of your lineup as a whole, one way or the other, but also just, how much are you pigeonholing yourself with Sale into lineups that everybody else is building. But that concern aside, obviously he looks really good. Chris Bassett showing up 24% for me. Honestly, I hate this. I get it as far as he's a completely decent pitcher. He's projected for 11% ownership. He's 8K, which is a reasonable price tag. Like, he's not really worse than any of your other pitching options today. When you look at the other guys on this slate, so you have David Festa, has made 7 starts this year, about a 27% K percentage. So he's the third highest strikeout percentage on the slate. Then you have to go down to Corbin Burns at 22.5%, Musgrove at 22%, Bassett at 22%. So he has one of the higher strikeout percentages on this slate. And he is facing a Red Sox team that does have some strikeouts in their lineup. They also don't have Rafael Devers, which is nice. Boston's active roster ranks 14th in K percentage against right-handed pitching. They do also have the second highest WRC plus. Again, that is driven in part by Rafael Devers, who isn't in the lineup. But the other concern that I have here with Bassett, which I think is a very legitimate concern, and it's why I said that even though I understand why he's showing up for me, just looking at it, I hate it. He struck out 24.5% of the right-handed hitters that he's faced this year. He's held them to an expected ISO below 100, an expected WOBA below 300. He has been lights out against right-handed hitters this year. Lefties have only a 20% K percentage, 369 expected WOBA, 208 expected ISO, and he's going up against this Red Sox lineup that, while, yes, it is missing Rafael Devers, it does still have Jarren Duran, David Hamilton, Tristan Casas, Willie Abreu, and Yoshida all hitting in the top 6. The only right-handed bat in the top 6 in this lineup is Tyler O'Neill, who, obviously can do damage himself. But it's really tough to look at this lineup and the way it's constructed, no Bassett splits, and have any amount of confidence in this guy pitching well. That being said, I'd be lying if I said I had confidence in any pitcher on this slate other than basically Chris Sale and, to some extent, Freddie Peralta pitching well. So, I'm okay if I end up taking this sort of stand where I'm 2x the field on Bassett. I just want to emphasize that it is a very scary spot to get to. He, like I said, just really struggles with lefties. This game is in Fenway Park, which we know is obviously a very tough place to pitch. So, I'm okay with getting to him here, but I really would not be upset if this comes down. And again, it just kind of comes back to there's no other pitchers that I love getting to either. But it's a really scary spot for Bassett. I would like to be getting to some Red Sox. I don't know if I am, but I would feel better about this if I just have both sides, because I do think it's a really scary spot. David Festa, 6,800. I do like this one. He is getting, or likely to get, the third most ownership on the slate. 6,800, taking on Atlanta. This is still an Atlanta lineup that can do damage. They do have good hitters in their lineup still. Matt Olson, Ozuna are both in there. But we know this lineup is a lot weaker than your typical Atlanta lineup. No Acuna, no Albies, no Austin Riley. So it's just a weaker lineup than usual. Ramon Laureano is batting 5th. Not to jinx him into a home run here, but at the start of the season, you certainly wouldn't have expected Ramon Laureano to be getting any at-bats in the 5-hole for the Braves. So we know it's a weaker lineup. There are strikeouts to be had. They're ranked 10th in strikeout percentage on their active roster, slightly below average WRC plus. And Festa has been solid through his first 7 major league starts, 27% K percentage, 3.55 xFIP. He has given up power, but small sample, those numbers are likely to come down. 175 expected ISO allowed to lefties compared to a 244 actual, 165 expected ISO allowed to righties compared to a 222 actual. So he is still going to give up some power, but he's gotten pretty unlucky so far as how many of those fly balls turn into home runs. And he's only $6,800. So you're getting him at a cheaper price point than Bassett, than Rodriguez, than Burns, even than Leiter and Severino. So I do like Festa here more than, I guess, most of these other options. It still certainly could go poorly for him, but he does project to be a pretty good strikeout guy going forward as well. Most of the projection models on FanGraphs that are publicly available have him with like a 23 to 24% K percentage rest of season. So coming down a bit from where it is right now, but still a pretty good K guy and pretty cheap. So Festa makes sense to me. And then I'm kind of just mixing and matching the rest of these guys. Max Meyer is interesting in your largest field tournaments just because he's facing the Rockies and he's low owned and he's cheap. So he's 6K, only projected for about 3% ownership. I got to about 9%, 8 or 9%. He hasn't been good in his 9 starts with Miami. He did have about a 27% K percentage at AAA, projects for like a 20 to 21% K percentage going forward. This is mostly just a function of pitching on this slate isn't very good. Like I've already said, there's really nothing that I love when all things are considered, and there's not much that I'm even comfortable with. So the opportunity cost isn't necessarily quite as high, but also Colorado should get a considerable amount of ownership here. They very obviously look like one of the best stacks to get to. If you happen to get a slate where the Rockies disappoint a pretty high percentage of the field, you do have a 6K pitcher going up against them. And we know the Rockies are an offense that strikes out a lot. They're not actually good overall. If this game were in Miami, Meyer would probably actually be, somewhat popular at least. So it's basically just a negative correlation play against the Rockies. But we usually don't make those as much with pitchers because you're just not knocking off as much as the field, or as much of the field rather, as when you go to negatively correlated stacks, because pitchers just get more ownership than batters get. But here, where the opportunity cost of pitcher isn't as high, Meyer at the cheap price tag, I can see it in large field tournaments. But again, not somebody that I want a lot of money invested in. I don't want to go into this slate saying, I'm just going to play 60% Max Meyer and see what happens. But relative to the field, I don't mind getting a little bit above it. Rodriguez getting some ownership here at 13%. $8,500 price tag facing the Mets. I have a hard time with this one. I don't mind that I'm not getting to the field on him. I think he's priced probably above his talent level at best. I think he's priced in line with his talent level, but we haven't even seen him perform to that level so far this year. He has missed most of the season. So I'm not saying that I think what he's done to date is what you get going forward. But even if you go back to his last couple of seasons, if you make him 8,500 against the Mets, it's kind of just like whatever, mediocre price tag that you're not really excited about. So the field getting there at 12, 13%, I'm okay not getting to as much. It is a tough strikeout matchup against the Mets. Corbin Burns, 8,700, Fields at 16%. I'm at about 5. I wouldn't mind getting more of him. He's cheap at 8,700. His strikeout numbers have come down this year. He's only striking out 22.5% of hitters. It is a scary matchup against the Dodgers. I mentioned this in the game-by-game notes article that I write for my Dub Club and Endgame subs. If you want to check that out, sign up for one of those. Links are in the description below. I did mention in there that I think you could kind of construct a narrative where maybe Burns gets more strikeouts tonight, because he has openly said that he's not striking guys out the same this year because he's not trying to. He's been prioritizing getting weak contact, getting at-bats over, working deeper into games. But going up against a team like the Dodgers that has the amount of talent that they have, I wouldn't be surprised, or at least you could make the case, knowing that Burns is, a smart, very well-prepared pitcher, that his game plan going into today could just be different, because I'm not sure letting Ohtani plus Betts plus Freeman plus Muncy plus Smith plus Hernandez put the ball in play is exactly the approach that you're looking to take. I would think if you can just, get swings and misses against those guys, you're probably going to feel a little bit better. So again, that's not based on anything, but it does logically make sense to me where we have seen Burns, like when he's in jams this year, have the ability to turn it on and go get strikeouts. Maybe you see that just from the jump here against the Dodgers. But it is a scary spot too, not only because the Dodgers are good, but this park is a very good park for offense, but more specifically, it's much better for right-handed power than Camden Yards is in Baltimore. And Burns, it's not a big weakness, but his biggest weakness is right-handed power he can be vulnerable against. So you get a lineup that, one, has it, and then two, you're facing them in Dodger Stadium instead of Camden Yards. That makes things a little bit more difficult for Burns. And then also, he is really bad at preventing stolen bases. The Dodgers aren't a team that runs a ton. They only have two guys with double-digit stolen bases, Ohtani and Mookie. I would absolutely expect those guys to be running any chance they get, but they do have other guys that run some. Teoscar Hernandez, Freddie Freeman, Miguel Rojas. These are guys, with like 5 to 10 stolen bases. Burns is incredibly bad at preventing stolen bases. So it's a situation where even if he's not pitching poorly, like he's not giving up home runs and doubles, he could still just give up earned runs because he gets unlucky, gives up a single, that turns into a double because the guy steals, and then he gives up another ground ball single, and you just lost fantasy points. So it is a scary spot, I think, for Burns, everything, considered. That's not to say it's a scarier spot for him than most of these guys, but those are kind of the concerns I have there. I think if I had to choose getting more of Rodriguez or Burns, I would rather get Burns first. Kyle Freeland is, oops, I just realized I had this set wrong. So that goes back to me trying to figure out the new SaberSim thing. Kyle Freeland is showing up 11% of the time for me. He's basically the same thing as Max Meyer. He's getting 5% ownership. He's 5,500. So he's bottom of the barrel as far as salary goes at pitcher on a weak pitching slate. There are bats that I want to get to on this slate that are relatively expensive. And also Miami is going to be popular. So if Freeland happens to pitch well, not only did you get a low-owned, cheap guy that scores fantasy points, but you also knocked off a pretty popular stack. So he's, pretty similar to both course pitchers are kind of the same to me. Brian Bayo not showing up much against Toronto. Tough strikeout matchup, decent pitcher. I feel like we've kind of just said the same thing about a lot of the pitchers on this slate. But here it is a tough strikeout matchup in a favorable park for hitting as well. He is getting a little bit less ownership than some of these other guys, but I'm not really getting there. Jack Leiter is another one where I think if I got more of him, I'd be pretty happy. He's getting 10% ownership. He's 7,100. The matchup against the White Sox is good. They are middle of the road when it comes to strikeouts. They are worst in the league in WRC plus against right-handed pitching. Jack Leiter made 3 starts earlier this year for Texas. He was absolute dog shit in those starts. They sent him back to the minors. He made 16 starts at AAA, struck out like 1/3 of the hitters that he faced. He projects to be a pretty good strikeout pitcher going forward in the majors. He's still not a finished product. He's still going to have his ups and downs, but it is a good matchup against the White Sox, and he's not getting a ton of ownership at 7,100. I do think it's likely that the Rangers have a relatively short leash on him. By that, I don't mean that he's on some really restrictive pitch count. I just mean that I wouldn't be surprised if he gives you 5 good innings and he's at 82 pitches. If they just say okay, cool, that's enough, you're done. He has only completed 6 innings in 3 of his 16 starts at AAA this year. He hasn't done it in any of his last 7. Now, that's not, again, it's not that they were just yanking him at 5 innings. In his last start, he went 5 2/3, so they gave him the chance to get to 6. It's just that he hasn't been all that pitch efficient. And then now, you're at the major league level, and Texas could very easily just be like, okay, cool, we got a good start out of you. Let's not push this any further. So I have some concerns about, how deep into the game does he go, even if he's pitching pretty well. But at 7,100, those aren't huge concerns. So I would actually not be upset if I was getting more Leiter. I certainly wouldn't tell you to barely play him. I do think it's a pretty good spot. Severino, again, not a great strikeout pitcher, tough strikeout matchup against Arizona. So that's how pitcher is shaking out for me. You can see in the field ownership that the field generally agrees with my assessment of the slate as a whole. Obviously, I'm getting to some pitchers more than the field and some less, but you can see that it's basically Peralta and Sale as the 2 guys that really stand out. And then it's kind of just interchangeable with Festa, Burns, Rodriguez, Bassett, Leiter, just a bunch of guys that are like, yeah, sure, that's your SP2, that's fine. Chuck Deuce has said Peralta's been dog shit at home versus lefties all season. Yeah, I mean, it's not a good park for limiting left-handed power. I generally don't really look into home road splits much outside of simply it's not a good park. And it's not. Overall, his numbers against lefties this year are fine. He has struck out lefties 27.2% of the time. 304 expected WOBA, 169 expected ISO. But I am on the same page too, where I'm not sure I've gotten a good Freddie Peralta start this year. And I feel like I play him every start. So like I kind of look at his numbers and I'm just like, okay, when did he accumulate these good numbers? Because they are never in the starts that I play him. But at the same time, you kind of have to take what you're given. If you want to use that to like make the argument that you're not going to play as much Peralta at 45% owned, that's fine. But the problem, and why for me it's probably not going to be the case, is okay, you can give these reasons why, Peralta is not a sure thing, but then start doing that for these other pitchers and it gets even uglier. So if you want to make the ownership case, I think that's like the strongest case against Peralta, more so than that, anything he struggles with, because every pitcher today outside of Sale struggles with something and or is in difficult matchups. But if you just wanted to say, look, I think all of these pitching options kind of suck outside of Sale, and so I'm going to just play more of the guys in this ownership range and less of Peralta, that's a perfectly reasonable stance. It's obviously not the one I'm taking right now, but I think it's very reasonable. It's just, it would much more be for the ownership considerations than any thing to do with Peralta's actual stats, because all of these guys have pretty big question marks. Also, he pointed out a favorable hitters ump in Milwaukee. Yeah, certainly not going to help things either if that's the case. So moving on to stacks now. Overall stack, Chicago at the top for me, going up against Leiter. So this is one reason probably that Leiter's not showing up for me as much, is that I am getting to some White Sox bats. I don't mind it. They're cheap. They're not going to be super popular. They are facing a pitcher who has not shown anything at the major league level yet. Again, Leiter is a former top pick, I think like third overall, maybe, if I remember correctly. He has good stuff. He's likely to be good going forward. He may or may not be at this point. He is going to get some ownership, so the White Sox do negatively correlate with the field at least somewhat. And even though they're a terrible offense overall, we do know that there is some stuff to like at their prices, where you're getting some stolen base upside, you're getting some power upside from guys like Robert and Vaughn. So just like yesterday, I would hope that these are more mini stacks than 5-mans. Looks like there are a lot of 5-mans too, which I'm not as excited about. But I do understand why they'd be showing up. Miami, very self-explanatory. One thing to keep in mind with Miami, and this is something that we did not have their lineup when I ran everything. We still do not have it. This is a team that I might end up getting a little bit less of when I adjust some stuff between now and lock, because I do have pinch hit concerns with this team. We don't have their lineup, but the projected lineup that I used has an entirely right-handed outfield going up against Freeland. So on the one hand, that's a really nice lineup for Miami. It's the projected lineup that I used is 9 right-handed bats going up against Freeland. Freeland has been very good at limiting left-handed power this year. Sub 100 expected ISO against left-handed hitters, 197 expected ISO against righties. So if you get this fully right-handed lineup, it does project well in Coors Field against Freeland. The problem is that if you get this lineup that has 3 right-handed outfielders with Derek Hill, David Hensley, and Christian Pache, you have 3. The normal starting outfield for Miami is all left-handed. So once Freeland gets out of the game, there's a very good chance that that string of right-handed outfielders just immediately becomes Jesus Sanchez, Kyle Stowers, and Griffin Conine. And you lose, 30% of your stack. So the caveats to that are the same as usual. There's no guarantee that all or any of these guys get pinch hit for. If Miami throws 10 runs on Kyle Freeland in the first inning, then they're less likely to pinch hit. And also these guys are cheap enough where they can get it done in 1 or 2 at bats, and you don't even necessarily care that they get pinch hit for. But when you factor in the ownership coming into Miami, I do think it's important to keep in mind that depending what lineup they run out there, there is pretty substantial pinch hit risk if every starting outfielder is starting this game on the bench for them. So that is something I want to pay attention to. I'm getting to the Mets, which I do like since I'm not really getting to Rodriguez, and the field is getting to him at 10 to 15%. I mentioned Rodriguez's struggles so far this season. I don't expect it to be a long-term thing, but that doesn't mean that today's the day he figures it out. Only a 16% strikeout percentage for him so far this year. The Mets are a difficult team to strike out. 211 expected ISO allowed the right-handed hitters so far this season. 169 since the start of last season. The Mets do have right-handed power. They have Lindor, Vientos, Martinez, Alonso, Marte, Alvarez. This is a team that can do damage, and I don't mind getting to them here. Texas going up against the White Sox. We have not gotten a confirmed starting pitcher, at least that I have seen, for the White Sox. It could be Touki Toussaint. He is listed now as the likely primary guy. But essentially, you're getting like a modified bullpen game here, most likely. That's never the most appealing situation, but when that involves White Sox relievers, it's not as bad. It is a bunch of guys that aren't very good at pitching, going up against a Texas offense that does have plenty of upside here. They're also just not particularly expensive, so that helps as well. Corey Seager is priced up, deservedly so. Every other hitter in Texas's projected lineup is less than 5K on DraftKings, so they should be pretty easy to get to from a stacking standpoint. The biggest issue probably for them is how do you handle ownership? Because if you were to go like Sale, Peralta, cheap Texas guys, that's kind of how everybody's going to be building these cheap Texas stacks, for example. But if you were to go, 5-man Texas, include the more expensive guys like Seager, and then get like a good mini stack with it or good one-offs with it, and maybe instead of playing Sale with them, you play, two of the mid-range pitchers. You can certainly make that work, but I do think from a full stacking standpoint, that would be the biggest potential issue with Texas, is just like how much are you overlapping with the field. Atlanta, Colorado, St. Louis, Arizona, all showing up pretty similarly as well. 5-mans, Mets at the top. So they really are grading out well for me against Rodriguez. Again, no issues with that. White Sox, I would prefer mini stacks, but 5-mans against Leiter are okay. It does make some sense too, just from the standpoint of we don't know what Leiter is at the major league level. And if he just doesn't have it, that is still obviously good for everybody on the White Sox. So it is a different matchup in some ways than yesterday was against Heaney, where I was playing a lot of the White Sox, but it was more so in mini stacks. Heaney's somebody that you expect to be a pretty solid pitcher, but he just gives up home runs, even when he's pitching well. Leiter is somebody that we don't know what he is as a pitcher, and he could just get lit up by everybody. Not to say that Heaney can't. Obviously, any pitcher can any given night. But when you're thinking about like when a guy, the way Heaney normally pitches, he still gives up home runs. And so grabbing one or two guys against him made a lot of sense. Full stacking against him made less sense. With Leiter, we don't necessarily know that he has those home run issues that Heaney does specifically, but you could just get a guy that is still a AAA pitcher at this point going up against what is kind of a AAA lineup, but does have some decent hitters in it. 5-man Texas stacks, I mentioned, you just need to pay attention to the ownership. Then spreading out more, Miami, Atlanta, San Diego, St. Louis, Baltimore. I wish I had more Colorado. Max Meyer has allowed power to both sides of the plate. And obviously this is a good park for everything offensive. But probably I assume ownership kind of just keeping me away from them. But if you're getting to them and offsetting ownership somewhere else, that is perfectly fine. Now, before we get into position by position, as a reminder, sign up using the links in the description below. Endgame Syndicate, the site that I launched with Brick75, Uticow, Nerdy Tenor. We have instructional videos out talking about a bunch of different things. I've gone through my lineup building process, both what I do and my thought process behind it, so that you can think about ways to improve yours, ways you can make adjustments. Brick has talked about some of the same. He's talked about how to build your own projections, your own ownership projections, how to more effectively use contest sims, if that is a part of your process, than maybe what is publicly recommended by some sites. Uticow has talked through his process for MLB, which is different than mine and anybody else I have ever talked to. A lot more of just kind of knowing the sport and then also understanding how to blend that in to make good lineups. So he's walked through that. We've done videos together where we go through our respective processes and look at the similarities in what we get. Nerdy Tanner has put out an entire series of toy games looking at a lot of different aspects of DFS. Also in the process of putting out a bunch of best ball stuff that is very interesting to me and useful if you are playing underdog type stuff. So check that stuff out. Also, Brick75's Draft Caddy is linked in the description as well. If you are finishing up your best ball drafts, that'll help you out. And then my MLB Dub Club is linked in there also. If for whatever reason the price point on Endgame doesn't make sense for you, you can still get access to my game by game article and my projections, ownership, top stack percentages, all of that using the Dub Club. So there's somebody in there for everybody. Check it out using the links in the description below. Peyton said that the Miami lineup is out. Norby, Berger, Bride, Hill, Hensley, Lopez, Conine, Pache, and Fortes. So it's similar to what I was talking about. It's not quite as drastic. You do have Conine in the starting lineup, but this lineup is problematic because you get a very, very good point per dollar projection on the 4 and 5 hitters because you have a $4,100 Hensley or Hill rather at 4,100 and then a $4,500 Hensley at 30. I lost it. 3,500, I think. 3,500 batting 4th and 5th. So they're going to project really, really well. The problem is like the third time through the order, there's a very good chance that just immediately turns into Jesus Sanchez and Kyle Stowers. So you are pretty likely to be getting limited at bats from those two, but they're still hitting in the middle of the order for at least a couple of at bats in Coors Field with the platoon advantage. So do pay attention to their ownership. If it gets inflated because of where they're hitting in the lineup, then I think kind of pulling back there makes some sense. So we already talked about pitching. Moving over to the catcher position, Corey Lee at the top. Same as yesterday, really. He's 2,500. He's likely to be hitting, 5th or 6th. We don't, it's probably not a great matchup against Leiter, but it's not terrible either. Most importantly, though, he's just cheap and not getting much ownership. Francisco Alvarez, I really like this one. Only about 4% owned. He's showing up 17% for me. He's got power. He's facing a pitcher in Rodriguez that doesn't appear to be back to his normal level of pitching so far, based on what he's done so far this year. So there is just that extra volatility there, which is nice. I like Alvarez at the low ownership. Jonah Heim getting some ownership. I'm pretty much in line with the field there. Sanchez, not in the lineup. It's Brian Fortes, but basically the same play. I'm around half the field. He's projected for 20%. I got to about 9. You can just, again, replace him with Fortes, and it's the same thing. It's not somebody that hits well. It's just a catcher in Coors Field that correlates with your Marlins. Sean Murphy, not very popular here, only getting 4 to 5% ownership. So I am a little bit above that. Just somebody that does have some power going up against a relatively popular pitcher in Festa. I said earlier, I do like Festa. I do expect to have a little bit more than the field, but in the lineups that don't have him, why not take some shots against him? He's certainly not unhittable or anything like that. And then kind of just spreading things out with the rest of the catchers there at the bottom. Drew Romo on Colorado, projected for 14% ownership. I'm a little bit below the field there as well. Never upset about, just not being with the field on the value bats that are getting ownership just because of what team they're on. It's not like these guys are great hitters. You can find cheap guys with a similar range of outcomes. Like Romo is going to project better than Lee because he's playing in Coors Field and Lee isn't. But the range of outcomes for these guys is about the same. So I never mind just sort of being under the field on those guys. Gary Sanchez, I'm not getting to. I think he's at a good spot. 12% projected ownership. He's relatively inexpensive. Kyle Harrison does struggle with right-handed power. I do have some concerns. We don't have the Milwaukee lineup, or we do now, and Sanchez is hitting 5th. So I do have some concerns. This is another team that I think you could see pinch hitters. They are running 8 right-handed hitters out there, and then Sal Frelick batting 9th. Gary Sanchez is DHing, so subbing him out of the game does not negatively impact them at all once a right-handed pitcher comes in. So this means that you have Bowers on the bench, you have Bryce Turang on the bench, and you have Garrett Mitchell on the bench. There's a pretty good chance that Monasterio is getting pinch hit for later in the game by Turang. There's a pretty good chance that Hoskins, at least one of Hoskins or Sanchez, is getting pinch hit for by at least one of Bowers, Mitchell, and it could certainly be both of them. So I think that the Brewers, this is an aside because I wasn't getting to them as a stack, and I do think it's an interesting spot for them since Harrison struggles with right-handed power. It's a park downgrade for Harrison, and Harrison struggles to prevent stolen bases. I think it's a very high upside spot for Milwaukee, but you run into the same issue where your 5, 6, and 7 hitters all conceivably could be out of the game by like the 7th inning, which obviously isn't ideal, but just wanted to mention that. I'm not really getting the Sanchez. I think he's, a good play. I'm just a little concerned about the pinch hit risk, but I think it's mostly just that for whatever reason, the Brewers weren't a team that I'm getting to, maybe because they're getting a little bit more ownership than I think is warranted. Not really getting the much Kirk here. He's getting ownership against Bayo. I get it because it's Fenway Park, but Bayo really isn't a terrible pitcher either. Righties this year against him only have a 124 expected ISO with a 26% strikeout percentage. So, yes, Kirk can still do damage in Fenway Park. He's cheap. He's a catcher. All that stuff's fine, but I don't look at this as an above average spot for him, and he is likely to be pretty popular. So don't mind not getting there. And if Toronto happens to go off against Bayo, then so be it. At first base, Andrew Vaughn showing up the most for me. Again, if I'm going to get to the White Sox, I certainly would hope that I'm getting to Andrew Vaughn. He's one of the only guys in this lineup that can actually do damage. He's not projected for much ownership, volatile matchup. So as long as, he's projected for low ownership, I don't mind it. Berger, I'm getting 19% at first base. I assume I have more at third base. So I am getting a ton of him here. He's projected for 18% ownership. He is not one of the Marlins that has pinch hit risk. He has a lot of power. He's facing a pitcher in Freeland that doesn't get strikeouts against right-handed pitchers, that doesn't do a good job of limiting power against right-handed hitters. Looks obviously really, really good for Berger, and it is one of the popular bats that I'm likely to be getting to. Luken Baker batting cleanup for St. Louis, getting 7% ownership, going up against Musgrove. Not a bad pitcher, not a great pitcher, not a great park for offense, but you have a 2K guy batting cleanup on a slate where, we're seeing some pretty ugly, cheap bats get ownership. I'll take the single digit owned cleanup guy and hope for the best. Pete Alonso, 2 to 3x the field. Think that looks pretty good. Low, I'm not getting to as much as the field. Field's at 14%. I'm at like 7. I already mentioned it. We don't know for sure who's pitching for the White Sox, but it is, I think, expected to be Touki Toussaint as the primary guy. He's not somebody that you should be shying away from taking guys against necessarily. He's not terrible. The problem with Toussaint is that he has some stuff that is good and difficult to hit. He has trouble throwing strikes. So he isn't consistently good, but when he's bad, a lot of times it's just him walking guys, giving up, hits here and there. But then when he's on, he actually can get major league hitters out. So he's not my favorite guy to stack against, but more so I think it's just the ownership here in the basically modified bullpen game. So I'm not getting to as much low at a deep first base position. And this does also reinforce the whole idea of opportunity cost at different positions. There's so many good options you can play at first base, whereas at catcher, there's not as many. So I was pretty even with the field on Jonah Heim. I'm just getting less Nathaniel Lowe, where I can play Baker or Alonso or Vaughn at, less ownership. The field is getting to those two primarily. Spencer Horwitz around 9%. I do like him more than I like Alejandro Kirk. Again, it just looks like I'm not getting to the Blue Jays, which is why I don't have much Horwitz. But Bayo has given up considerably more power to left-handed hitters than right-handed hitters. 188 expected ISO to lefties, 212 actual ISO. He's also only struck lefties out 17.5% of the time compared to striking righties out about 26% of the time. So pretty big splits there where lefties do more damage and also don't strike out as much. So I am more concerned about not having much Horwitz than I am about not having much Kirk. Michael Toglia, again, I said it before, I wish I were getting to Colorado more overall. I think it's a good spot for him against Meyer in Colorado. He does have power. He's batting 5th, but he is up to 5,200 and just looks to be a spot that I'm not really getting too much. Same goes for Jonah Bride. Second base, Otto Lopez at the top, pretty much in line with the field, just is going to look good. Not as likely to get pinch hit for either. So at 3,700 at second base in Coors Field, that's going to look good. Whit Merrifield leading off against Festa just looks like a good value because of that spot in the order. Again, Festa has given up some power this year, even though he's gotten unlucky. He's still, in terms of expected power, given up some. Merrifield is cheap, leading off at a relatively weak position. So they both look pretty good. Marcus Semien, you're paying up a little bit more, but Fields at about 15%. I'm at 10 to 11. Connor Norby, this is only second base exposure. So I'm about half the field there. Maybe at third base, I make up the other half. The $3,900 price tag is good. Norby is a good hitter. He was a good hitting prospect in the O system. He projects to be average or better in the majors. Good value, all of that. It's really just, an ownership thing, but how much you can get to. But he's not one of the guys with pinch hit risk. He does have the platoon advantage against Freeland, which is big. So obviously a good play. Just make sure that you can make the ownership work. Bogarts, I'm a little over the field going up against Payante. I don't love the spot for San Diego. Like, I don't mind getting to San Diego bats whenever they're low owned just because they're good. But Andre Payante does not give up power. He's not a very good strikeout pitcher, and it's a very difficult strikeout matchup, which is why I'm not getting to him as a pitching play. I know I saw somebody mention him earlier. It's not a play that I'm likely to be getting to. The Padres have the lowest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year at 16.7%. Payante has only struck out 18.8% of hitters so far this year, but he does have a 3.77 xFIP, and right-handed hitters this year have a 109 expected ISO against him. Lefties are below 100. He's a much better real-life pitcher than DFS pitcher, and so even though the Padres are low-owned, again, like, I'm not upset about 10% Bogarts, but this is not a pitcher that gives up much power. Brooks Baldwin, I seem to kind of always get to a little bit when I'm going to the White Sox just because he does give stolen base upside. Same for Sosa. The field is getting to Norby, Lopez, Semien, and Merrifield. David Hamilton batting second with no Rafael Devers. There is some pinch hit risk for Hamilton, but he does have that good platoon advantage against Bassett. I mentioned earlier how much damage lefties do against him. Second base, shortstop eligible. I'm just not getting to him much. I don't think I'm getting to Boston a ton overall. But like I said earlier, that is a spot where I'm comfortable with my process. I trust my process. I play what it gives me. But my head would much rather be playing Red Sox bats than Chris Bassett. That being said, right now at least, I'm not really getting there. And there is some pitch hit risk. As I mentioned, the Red Sox do have righties on their bench. One thing that is good for Hamilton is that Romy Gonzalez and Ceddanne Rafaela are both starting this game. You don't have Devers, so they are a little bit more limited as far as what they can do. Like, they need Gonzalez to play third base in Devers' place. So that does lower pinch hit risk a little bit. I'm double checking their roster now to see if it's more than a little bit. They could, I think, go to like Gasper maybe at second base, but I do think Devers being out actually makes Hamilton a better play, not only because he's hitting second, but because you have to use Romy Gonzalez over at third base. You can't throw him in for Hamilton once a left-handed pitcher comes in. Toronto does have 3 left-handed relievers in their bullpen, though, so that is something to keep in mind when you're considering going to the Red Sox. So moving over to third base, where I assume I have more Berger and more Norby. 15% more Berger, 13% Norby. So that does get me a little over the field on Norby, way over the field on Berger. Obviously, like both of those guys a lot. Mark Vientos, again, if you're going to the Mets against Rodriguez, you want the right-handed power bats, and Vientos is one of them. 4,700 is pretty expensive, but you can make it work pretty easily here. Josh Young, I'm around the field in that matchup against the White Sox, getting to a little bit more Sosa here. Arenado a little bit against Musgrove at basically no ownership. The field is getting to a lot of Josh Smith, which I do not appear to be getting much of, at least at third base. Maybe I have a little bit more in the outfield, but kind of, again, sticking with the theme where I'm kind of even with the field or lower on most of these Texas guys, getting to the Miami guys a little bit, more in line with the field, if not over, as far as popular bats go. Barger is hitting 5th for Toronto. That's a good value bat at 2,900. He does have the platoon advantage that I was saying you want against Bayo. He is also pretty popular here, so I'm not getting as much of him. McMahon against Meyer, again, I think looks good. I think it's just an ownership thing. And this all does just go back, also keep in mind, to the pitchers. I had a ton of Freddie Peralta, and then I also had a lot of Chris Sale. So I do have a decent amount of Sale plus Peralta lineups where I have 2 popular pitchers. And then most of my lineups have at least one of them. So it also just makes it harder for me to get to these double-digit owned stacks. If you are, like we were talking about earlier, saying I'm not going to play 45% Peralta, I'm going to take chances on, lower owned Burns or Festa or Rodriguez or whoever. then that does allow you to get to more of these Red Sox, Rangers, Blue Jays, Rockies that the field is playing. So a lot of this does have to do with the pitchers that you're playing as well. Rims and Tim said, unrelated subject, when will you have football shows coming out? Still can't believe how far ahead of the curve you were with Justin Jefferson back in the day. Yeah, I still remember the show where I was told he wasn't a top 10 NFL receiver. But yeah, I'm still figuring out exactly what I'm going to do for football. I will, at the very least, be doing a version of this show on Sunday mornings, going through tournament exposures. It's also likely that I extend the stuff that I'm doing for my MLB Dub Club and Endgame to NFL, where if you sign up for Dub Club or Endgame, you get access to, my projections, stacking percentages, optimal percentages, all of that. I haven't and a game by game article. I haven't completely decided if I'm doing that, but I most likely am. I'll tweet and talk about that more once I decide for sure. But at the very least, I'll have an NFL tournament show on this Endgame channel on Sunday mornings. Maybe some other stuff during the week. Not sure. My thought process is that during the week, I'll probably continue doing baseball shows and then switch that over to basketball and then do NFL on Sunday. But that could change. Again, at the very least, I will be doing a show here Sunday mornings. Some talk about Bayo. Yeah, he's fine. Like, it's a tough strikeout matchup. It's a tough park to pitch in, all of that. No pitcher on this slate is without concern, as I've already mentioned. Did you get stung by the Rangers PPD yesterday? Yeah, the White Sox were my, I think, most exposed team. I know Luis Robert was my highest owned hitter individually. I was below the field on Heaney, but yeah, that absolutely sucked. Moving over to shortstop slowly. Nicky Lopez, it's disgusting, but he's cheap. He's leading off. Shortstop isn't the best position today. You do have Gunnar in what's actually a pretty good spot against Walker Buehler. You have Lindor, you have Seager, but you don't have De La Cruz. So it's not, as deep a position. Nicky Lopez in 25% of my lineups, you're just hoping he gets on base, steals, and, if you're playing the White Sox, you may as well be playing Lopez, but it's not like he's a great one-off. He doesn't give you a ton of, home run upside or anything like that. I do like getting to Lindor at low ownership. I'm always fine getting to Corey Seager, not getting quite as much as the field, though, which is pretty much in line with what it appears I'm doing with Texas in general. Vidal Brujan, 10% ownership. I have 7% at shortstop. I probably have a little bit more in the outfield. 3,700 value bat in Coors Field. Assuming that he's in the lineup, I already forgot. He's not, so don't play Vidal Brujan. Instead, they might not have a shortstop. Yeah, so anyway, don't play Brujan, but there's other cheap guys on Miami. We already talked about their outfielders, but yeah, he's not in the lineup, so ignore that. For the field, Seager leading the way, Brujan, Aaron Schunk. Again, like, if Aaron Schunk's going to be 10% owned, I get he's in Coors Field. He's batting ninth. And Nicky Lopez leading off is going to be 5% owned. I'll just play more Nicky Lopez. They have the same range of outcomes, more or less. Drop Rosa said, any problem with Ozuna and Olsen today? No. Festa gives up some power. He's been unlucky as far as how much he's given up, but does still give up power. Also likely to get 15 to 20% ownership. So I don't have any issue with going to either one of those guys. Wrapping things up in the outfield, I assume it's going to be Marlins guys, and I'm going to have to figure out what to do with them. Not as concentrated here as I thought, and I really like that, actually. So Luis Robert, 27%. Fine. Again, if I'm playing the White Sox, I would hope that I'm playing Luis Robert. If you're not playing the White Sox, I certainly don't think that, you have to be like jamming Luis Robert in. This, just like all the other White Sox I'm getting to, is pretty contingent on the fact that I happen to be stacking the White Sox a lot. So obviously I do like getting to the White Sox here. But what I'm trying to say is, it's if the White Sox do well, you assume that Robert, Vaughn, Lopez, those guys are all pretty likely to have had good games. If you're just not playing the White Sox, then I don't think you need to be going out of your way to jam in a bunch of Robert. Starling Marte, same kind of thing. If you're playing the Mets, I want to be getting to him. Then you get to Derek Hill, who has a good lineup spot, has the platoon advantage, does have pretty significant pitch hit risk. I think, if I were to come in around 14%, I'm perfectly fine with that. You just want to pay attention probably and make sure that you're not getting massive amounts of him, especially if he ends up being really popular. He's projected for like 12% ownership. if that comes up with him batting cleanup, like if you were to just like at 6:00 or 6:30, he's projected for like 25% ownership, then I would start probably kind of like backpedaling the other direction and just hoping that he doesn't hit a home run in one of his first couple at bats. But if he is just going to get, 11, 12, 13% ownership, I'm fine being right around that. He is still going to get at least a couple of at bats here. There's no guarantee he gets pinch hit for, and he's obviously in a very good spot. Adolis Garcia, 4,300 power, speed upside right around the field there. Benintendi, same thing with the White Sox, I've already said. I am happy that I'm getting to Jarren Duran here kind of individually. Obviously, one of the best left-handed hitters on the Red Sox. It is interesting to me that I'm a little over the field on him, but I'm barely getting to anybody else on Boston. But he is also a perfectly fine one-off if that's what it is. Like if I'm getting, I can take a look, but if I'm getting teams where, it's like a 5-2 with Duran one-off or something, I think that is perfectly fine. So like here, it's a Red Sox 2-man with Romy Gonzalez, 2-man with Yoshida, one-off in a White Sox core stack. Like, yeah, it's perfectly fine. He gives you stolen base upside. He also has home run upside. He's like the perfect example of somebody that you can just one-off because he can get it done on his own without the Red Sox as a whole having a good game. And he is in a good spot against Bassett as well. Guitar Man said Blake Perkins showing up in a lot of my lineups. Yeah, he's got a good spot in the batting order. He is, I think, hitting like second. So he looks like a pretty good vet. Yeah, hitting second at 2,400, switch hitter. Harrison doesn't hold runners well either. And I don't remember off the top of my head, but I feel like Perkins can run. 17 stolen bases this season for Perkins. So he's a good play. I said it before that I'm not getting Milwaukee, but I do like them. Stolen base upside was one of the reasons, and Perkins is a switch hitter, so he is less likely to be pinch hit for later, which is also nice. So I do like that. JD Martinez, Brandon Nimmo. Nimmo, lefty, but if I'm stacking the Mets, I'm going to get some Nimmo. Martinez is obviously the guy that I would prefer there. The field is getting to Josh Smith, you already mentioned. Garcia, Blackman, I'm a little below the field on. Barger, I'm a little below the field on. Same for Varsho. I don't really have any problems with who the field is getting to. I don't look at any of these guys and think that these are bad plays or what is the field doing. I can very easily explain why all of these guys are getting ownership, and I would assume that they would all get ownership because they all are good. The reason that you're just seeing even more so on this slate than some other slates, me kind of just not get to the field on the most popular plays is basically the inverse of what I was talking about with the pitching. Like with pitching, when I was describing the pitching on this slate, it was basically, Sale clear number one as far as talent goes, Peralta number two, and then just like a bunch of pitchers that are fine. And you can tell me that Burns is your favorite for this slate. You could tell me that it's Bassett. You could tell me that's any of those guys, and I don't really have much of an argument with you. The inverse of that, though, applies to the bats, where Miami and Colorado, the Coors game obviously is just like the best overall game on the slate. It's Coors Field. It's two not very good pitchers. It is two bad offenses also. But outside of that, the matchups, and for the most part, parks, are pretty comparable from a range of outcome standpoint. If the field is going to heavily play against Brian Bayo, I don't mind playing against Jack Leiter instead. If, again, obviously the Blue Jays offense is better than the White Sox, so it's not complete apples to apples, but, just kind of making that point, thinking about the pitchers. Like if you wanted to play the Dodgers against Burns, I think Burns is the best pitcher outside of Sale from a talent standpoint on this slate, and he's the third best DFS pitcher just because Peralta gets more strikeouts. But, the Dodgers range of outcomes isn't any different than the Blue Jays or the Red Sox. So I think that the stacks you go to are just really, really wide open. And that's why you're seeing even, me not getting to the field at most of these positions as far as the most exposed guys. A couple questions in chat about the Dodgers or I think just about the Orioles maybe. Haven't heard any of your O's offense tonight. Yeah, I actually had bumped them extra in my projections because I think that it's likely they're being underprojected because Buehler has such a history of being a good pitcher, and Buehler just looks completely washed. It's not just that he's been bad through 10 starts. He's only struck out 17% of hitters. He's allowed 2.2 home runs per 9, 4.7 xFIP. But his swinging strike percentage is like 7% so far this year. His career average is 11%. his chase percentage on pitches outside of the zone, which is generally a good way to indicate how good your stuff is. Will hitters swing at pitches they shouldn't, is like 21% this year. His career average, if I remember correctly, is like 30 or 28 or something like that. So his fastball velocity is down. He just looks like not a good pitcher anymore. So I actually did bump Baltimore projections just to try and make sure that that I wasn't waiting back when he was good too much. I still didn't get to Baltimore though, which was kind of disappointing. So if you're asking as far as like you like them, I think they're a good stack. They're just not one that I'm getting to for whatever reason. I don't know if it's price or what. The other side of that too, the Dodgers, I kind of wanted to be getting to also for the reasons I mentioned when I talked about Burns. Obviously I think he's a good pitcher, but he is in a park that plays up right-handed power more than his home park, and he's facing a team that has plenty of guys that will run if given the opportunity, even beyond Ohtani and Betts, and Burns gives you the opportunity. So I think the last game of the night, the Dodgers Orioles game, I don't have much of it right now. I really wish that I did, because I do think that it kind of like everybody's going to the Boston-Toronto game, it looks like, because it's a good hitter's park. It's good offenses. It's, mediocre pitching, not terrible pitching, but like average to slightly above average pitching. It's the same thing in this Dodgers game. Burns is good, but he does have, his weaknesses the Dodgers can exploit. He also has a bad bullpen behind him. The Dodgers are running out Walker Buehler in 2024, who is not Walker Buehler from previous years. So yeah, I'm not really getting there, but in my head at least, I feel like this Dodgers game is kind of just a lower owned version of this Red Sox game that people are targeting. So good questions there. Again, it's a reminder that just because I'm playing stuff or not playing stuff doesn't mean I like or dislike it. It's just everything functions together as far as ownership, projection, range of outcomes, all of that stuff. And so I'm showing you what I'd be getting to, but that doesn't mean that game's not looking good, because I actually think that it does. Baltimore in a major slump right now, though. I mean, yeah, but also don't really care. They are who they are. Like the problem with slumps is you don't know what's causing them. You don't know when they're starting. You don't know when they're ending. If somebody is hurt, so like Adley Rutschman has not really been himself for like over a month. He got hit in the hand, I think it was. That's a spot where like I think you could actually reasonably say, like, I'm not playing Adley until I see him actually start crushing baseballs. But outside of that, Gunnar Henderson hasn't been nearly as good in the second half as the first half, but I still know he's a very good hitter, and I'm not going to just wait for him to string a few good games together to start playing him again. For the most part, like unless there's an injury or something, it's really just difficult to factor in to make that actionable for DFS. Kind of similar to like the same way you talk about BVP. It exists, but good luck knowing when it actually exists. Jake DeWitt was the other one that had asked about Baltimore. Chuck Deuces said Toronto has some left-handed hitters now, which is the only issue, but I think he's as viable as Bassett or really close. Talking about Bayo, yeah, I would like Bayo more if Toronto had more right-handed hitters. Also, if they were easier to strike out, but to your point, I don't think his range of outcomes isn't any different than Bassett's, I don't think. So if there's no more questions, I'm going to get out of here. Thanks again for checking out the show. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button. Do I think Seager plays in both games? I have no idea. The game starts at 8:10, so we should have that lineup out, I would think. I didn't actually look to see when the earlier game was being played. So they're only top 4 now, so we actually might not have that lineup. Or won't have that lineup probably. I would guess he does. I mean, it's not like they can just bench their whole team, and I assume they would like to try and win a game. But yeah, I would assume he does. So actually, I will say though, one thing, I had Jonah Heim in my projected lineup here. He's probably not playing. He's catching the first game. At best, he's DHing the second game. So like that would be a difference. But as far as the position players go, I think you kind of just assume that their normal lineup comes out. Home run pick. I actually got Chapman yesterday, even though that did nothing. I had a shitty DFS day. At least I got my home run pick. Home run pick here. I will I feel like I had one during the show and then forgot it. I will go with Wilson Contreras in Milwaukee. Or William Contreras in Milwaukee. But yeah, so other than that, thanks for checking out the show. Good luck on your lineups tonight. Hit the thumbs up button, all of that. I'll be back here same time tomorrow for tomorrow's, I think, like 4-game slate. We'll talk through that one. Should be pretty interesting from a game theory standpoint. So see you back here tomorrow.